But there was no steam in his voice. Taking a whipping was bad enough, but to learn that his subjects dreaded the day he'd grow up and become king had deeply shaken him. She meant no harm, Jemmy murmured, keeping his eyes alert for soldiers. Is that what they call me? Prince Brat? Jemmy nodded. Does everyone hate me? More than likely. What about you? Jemmy hesitated for a moment. I did, but maybe I don't. Jemmy couldn't sort out his feelings. The pot's full. Let's go. It took the two of them to carry the iron kettle, now full of water. They passed a magician with a bald head, a street fiddler, and an umbrella seller. His wares opened around his feet like black silken mushrooms. Suddenly there loomed up a soldier on horseback, his eyes on the search. There was nothing to do but brazen it out. Jemmy took a tighter grip on the handle, but was ready to fly if he had to. The soldier passed by with only the merest glance. What was he looking for? A prince in fine velvets and a crown cocked on his head? Was it clothes that made a prince, Jemmy wondered, just as rags made a street boy? He had a notion that the prince felt secretly disappointed not to be recognized by any of his subjects. Wasn't he getting his head stuffed with surprises? Before long, potatoes were boiling in the pot. Not far off, Betsy had drawn a crowd with Petunia now balancing a gentleman's hat on his nose, and then the bear began passing the hat for tips. Jemmy no longer felt the slightest concern about the soldiers. He had no doubt that Hold-Your-Nose Billy would trace him and the prince to the fair. Hadn't they fallen into the company of a girl with a trained bear? Where else could she be going? Finally, Captain Nips began spearing boiled potatoes, and Betsy returned with Petunia. We could eat a bushel, she exclaimed, jingling a handful of coins. Courtesy to fellow artistes, said Captain Nips, refusing the money. He split open a pair of plump potatoes. Salt and pepper? Pepper for me, salt for Petunia. Captain Nips reached into one coat pocket for a pinch of salt and into the other for pepper. Salt for me, said Jemmy. And you, Captain Nips? Asked the prince. The heir to the throne balked for a moment, and Jemmy knew why. He'd certainly never eaten a potato before. In the castle, roots were regarded as peasant food. I don't know, the prince stammered. When in doubt, salt, chuckled Captain Nips. And then he began calling out to the passing crowd. Hot, hot, hot potatoes! Captain Nips, hot, hot potatoes! Jemmy gorged himself, anxious to be off and not certain when he would eat again. The prince nibbled at first with his fingers and then threw his royal pride to the winds. He bit off whole mouthfuls. A ballad seller was working his way through the crowd, crying out his wares. He waved a bamboo pole with long paper streamers fluttering from the tip. 3 yards of songs a copper. Old songs, new songs, sing 'em yourself. 10 verses of poor, pitiful Polly will make you weep. 16 verses of that notable highwayman, Hold-Your-Nose Billy. Jemmy's ears pricked up as the ballad seller began singing a sample of his merchandise. Hold-Your-Nose Billy, a wild man is he, hang him from a gallows tree. Here he comes, there he goes, don't forget to hold your nose. The street song had once amused Jemmy, but now he only sharpened his eyes. He wiped his hands on his sleeves and turned to Captain Nips. Thanks for the grub, sir. Where are you off to? Asked Betsy. Here's the place to put a jingle in your pockets. Can't you turn cartwheels or something? I catch rats, Jemmy said simply. Rats? Betsy made a face. What on earth for? There's good money in sewer rats. The meaner, the better. My eyes, exclaimed Betsy, don't you get bit? Many a time, said Jemmy. Captain Nips cocked an ear. What's that running patterer yelling about? A crow-like voice pierced the air, and then the news seller appeared, his tongue wagging like a bell clapper, a bundle of broadsides under his arm. Prince, sold to the gypsies, the true and genuine facts, ink still wet, whipping boy charged with dastardly scheme, king offers reward for the unspeakable rascal. Dead or alive, full description, get your copy, keep your eyes peeled, and catch the reward. The running patterer was selling his broadsides almost as fast as he could yell. The facts were cockeyed, but Jemmy grabbed his birdcage, backed off, and was gone. Chapter 19, being a full account of the happenings in the dark sewers. Jemmy headed for the only safe place he knew, the sewers. He scrambled along the docks, and the prince dogged him every step of the way. Jemmy turned on him like a cornered rat. "Ain't you done enough? You got a price put on my head. Go home and go to blazes." "But you're my friend," the prince stated, as if he were issuing a royal decree. "Don't count on it," replied Jemmy. He started down stone steps to the river, but the prince stopped him with a sudden urgent yelp. "Look!" Looming up on the cobbled wayside came the hulk of Hold Your Nose Billy, with Cutwater following as close as a cow's tail. Jemmy didn't wait to be spotted, but it was too late. The big outlaw, his hair and beard looking bonfire red under the bright sun, gave a distant yell and altered course. Jemmy and the prince took the stairs in leaps. The tide was coming in, and the mud flat had shrunk to the width of a path. Jemmy led the way through a tarred forest of wharf pilings and over a derelict river barge. He leaped off into shallow water. He could already see the great brick mouth of a main sewer. "Don't leave footprints in the mud," he warned. They splashed along the water's edge and were there. The arched sewer stood tall enough for a horse and rider. Jemmy leaped the mud and was in. But the prince balked. "It's black as night in there. Jump, quick!" The prince steeled himself and made the leap. Jemmy advanced into the tunnel, but the prince held back. "Follow me. We'll be lucky if they didn't catch sight of us." The prince stood terrified of the darkness ahead. He had turned dead white. Jemmy made a grab and yanked the prince after him. "You'll get me caught." I'm scared, Jemmy." "Don't fret about the dark. There are rats in here. Even grown men are scared of 'em. Hang on to me." Deeper and deeper, darker and darker, they sloshed through the cavernous sewer. The gutters of the city overhead had dried, but old rain seeped and dripped from the glazed brick walls. Soon the mouth had receded to little more than a pinhole of light, and Jemmy stopped to catch his breath. "Blacker'n a stack of black cats in here, ain't it? We should come to another passage before long. They'll never find us. Ease off my arm. You'll break it." "Jemmy." Hardly above a breath, the prince's voice was stiff with fear. "Jemmy? Not Jemmy from the streets? Not boy?" The wonder of it, Jemmy thought, like he was old knockabout friends of the streets. "I wish I were like you," muttered the prince. Jemmy was amazed. "Like me?" "You're not afraid of anything." "Course I am. I'm afraid your pa'll hang me." "Not likely." Jemmy gave a small snort. "Not likely unless you give away my hiding place down here." "Do you think I'd do that, Jemmy?" "I don't know. Let's keep moving." As they edged along the wet walls, Jemmy gave his reply a second thought. He'd wronged the prince. This wasn't the same prince brat who'd run away the night before, bored with his own meanness and haughtiness and cruelty. "Reckon I do trust you," said Jemmy. And the prince replied, "I won't go back to the castle unless you go with me." Gah! The main sewer branched off, and Jemmy had to stop to get his bearings. Careful, he thought. That passage to the left leads to the brewery. You could get eaten alive. Keep to the right branch. In the hollowness of the sewer, there came a soft scurrying of feet, and then a distinct squeaking sound. The prince's fingers locked on Jemmy's arm like a manacle. "Nothing but a rat," Jemmy said. "2 of 'em. But nothing to worry about yet. Dark ain't so bad if you know what's in it. Like off to the left, so hang on to me." The prince's voice was almost inaudible. What's to the left? A brewery overhead. They empty their used-up grain down the sewer, and the rats feed and breed by the hundreds, grow big as street cats. And short-tempered, they'll swarm all over you and hang on by their teeth. Still clinging to the birdcage, Jemmy continued feeling his way along. He'd wondered how he'd ever felt at home in these dank, smelly sewers. Then a sudden flicker of light from a side passage stopped him. He peered down the tunnel and saw a figure with a candle fixed to the stiff bill of his cap. A rat catcher. He could see a cage full of squealing rats. He entered the passage and the man looked up. "Who goes there?" "Didn't mean to give you a scare," Jemmy whispered. "This is no place for boys." The man's full voice boomed and echoed through the sewers, and Jemmy took a quick look behind. "Hold it down, sir," he said softly, and then he thought he recognized the rat catcher. "Ain't you old Johnny Tosher?" With the candle glowing from his hat bill, the man bent forward. "I declare, is that you, Jemmy?" "It is." "Ain't you grown since you left the sewers?" "I'd be obliged if you'd snuff out your candles, sir. There's bloodthirsty ruffians after us." "Speak up," said the old man, cupping a hand to his ear. "Is it true you've gotten taken up by the king himself? That's the gossip. What are you doing back in the sewers?" "Running for our lives." "Eh? Your candle will give us away." "What's that?" "You'd do us a kindness to pinch it out." "Speak up, lad. Now you're a king's little gentleman, they learn you to talk in whispers? Come back for a visit, have you? Oh, your pa'd be proud." He gave the top of Jemmy's head a pat. "They say you're Prince Brat's own whipping boy." Suddenly the rat catcher straightened. "Who's there?" Looming up in the yellow glow stood an immense, hairy figure and a rattle-boned man. Jemmy's heart stopped cold. "What the blazes?" roared Hold-Your-Nose Billy. "They flummoxed us, Cutwater. That one ain't the prince, it's the other." "I heard," Cutwater cried out. "We whipped the prince himself. Worse'n common murder, you said." "Aye, the king'll skin us alive by inches." "Mercy on us." "But not if he don't find out." Both lurched forward to grab the boys. Jemmy swung the birdcage, knocking the candle flying. The flames sputtered out in the murky water, and the sewer was thrown into sudden darkness. "Run for it," Jemmy yelled out. "I got one," cackled Cutwater. "That's me you got," bellowed the rat catcher. "Scurvy riff-raff, who are you?" Jemmy flattened himself against the wall and found the prince already there. He heard a splash and a curse as Hold-Your-Nose Billy must have tumbled over Cutwater and the rat catcher. In an urgent whisper, the prince asked, "Which way?" Jemmy made an instant decision. The villains might be able to run them down in this smaller side channel. Back to the main sewer! He gave the prince's sleeve a quick tug, and the prince reached out for Jemmy's hand. Off they went, linked together while the outlaws untangled themselves. "Which way did they go?" cried Cutwater. "Listen for 'em." Jemmy froze. He didn't breathe. He waited. And he became suddenly aware of the prince's hand clasped in his own. His first impulse was to withdraw his fingers, but the prince was hanging on for dear life. It was the same as a handshake, and he remembered the prince's own words. It felt friendly and trusting, but gah, the wonder of it, shaking hands with Prince Brat. "Stop where you stand," warned Hold-Your-Nose Billy. "Wherever you are, we'll catch you," added Cutwater. "You'll never make it out." "Which way is out?" snapped the big outlaw. "The same way you came in," answered the rat catcher. "Put your back to the breeze from the main sewer." That was wrong. Good old Tosher, Jemmy thought. He meant to send them off in the opposite direction. Jemmy tugged on the prince's hand, and they scuttled along the wall toward freedom. A moment later, Jemmy could feel a stronger breeze, and he knew that they were in the main sewer again. Noses to the breeze, they could make a run for the river. But in his sudden elation, Jemmy banged into the wall with the birdcage. His hair rose. The clatter was loud enough to wake the dead, or bring the villains running. Jemmy made an abrupt turn, pulling the prince deeper into the main sewer, and he whispered, "They'll see us against daylight before we can get out. More holes than wormwood down here. We'll duck into another side tunnel, but if we break loose, don't lose your bearings. The brewery's dead ahead." The sound of feet sloshing through the water silenced them. Jemmy felt desperately for the mouth of a side tunnel, but Hold-your-nose Billy and Cutwater had already rushed out into the main sewer. "Which way, Billy?" muttered Cutwater. Jemmy flattened himself against the grave, cold wall, but the prince seemed suddenly to rebel at being chased down like a sewer rat. He yanked the birdcage out of Jemmy's hand and flung it with all his might. It banged and clattered off the bricks in the direction of the brewery. "What's that?" cried out Cutwater. "Them is what! Put your back to the breeze, straight on!" They barged ahead. Only moments later, old Tosher appeared across the great sewer, a fresh candle lit on the bill of his cap. And then Hold-your-nose Billy and Cutwater came flying back. "I'm bit! I'm bit! Help!" Grain-fed rats were swarming over the two of them, nipping and biting and clinging like leeches. In the light of the candle, Cutwater waved his arms wildly. He screeched and the hairy outlaw bellowed. "I declare," said the prince, "they look like they're wearing fur coats." Chapter 20, in which the sun shines and we learn what befell the whipping boy, the prince, and everyone else. Standing in the clear sunshine, the prince breathed in the sweet, fresh air. Then he looked Jemmy squarely in the eyes. "We're going back to the castle." "Not me. Your paws put a price on this head of mine." "No, thank you, Prince. I don't fancy doing a jig from the end of a rope." "Where will you hide for the rest of your life? In the sewers?" "I'd have them searched, end to end." God, what a fool he'd been to let the prince in on his best hiding place. Jemmy was on the verge of running, but where to? How far would he get? "You said you trusted me," declared the prince, "but I can see you didn't mean it." "I meant it, up to a point." "Then follow me." It was a command. Jemmy swallowed hard and followed. They weren't at the castle gates yet. He'd think of something. The prince led him back onto the fairgrounds and searched out Betsy and the hot potato man. "You've served your prince nobly," he announced. "What are you talking about, lad?" replied Captain Nips. "Hot, hot potatoes!" "The king has offered a reward for the whipping boy. Here he stands. Turn him in." And Jemmy stood dumbfounded. He felt betrayed. "Gah!" Betsy flashed her eyes. "Turn Jemmy in? I'll do no such thing." "I command it." "Who are you to command anything?" I'm Prince Brat." "Ha! Run for it," Jemmy thought. Deeply wounded, he gave the prince a last blazing look. The prince returned a quick, playful wink. It befuddled Jemmy for an instant, and then, in a flash, Jemmy saw that for the first time the prince was up to a kindly piece of mischief. "Head to toe, he's Prince Brat," said Jemmy. "Better do what he says or he'll have you boiled in oil." Jemmy had to wait with Betsy, Petunia, and Captain Nips while the prince was alone with the king. Finally, a pair of golden doors were opened and the group was ushered into the throne room. The king sat with his legs crossed and the merest flicker of a smile on his lips. Betsy bowed low and Captain Nips did the best he could. "The reward is yours," the king announced, and then he turned to the prince. "What about the bear? Came to your rescue, did he? Couldn't we give him the title of official dancing bear to your royal majesty, Papa? He'd draw crowds wherever he went." Done. Betsy and Captain Nips were dismissed. Jemmy now stood alone. It seemed hours while the king gazed at him. He began to feel a noose tightening around his neck. "You ought to be whipped." "Yes, my lord." "Prince Horace has caused enough mischief to wear out the hides of a dozen whipping boys. He tells me it's thanks to you that he's back, sound and safe. The king thanks you." Jemmy took a small breath. "You are placed under the prince's protection under one condition. He has sworn to do his lessons, blow out his night candle, and otherwise behave himself." Jemmy's eyes flicked to the prince. "Gah!" he thought. "You must want me for a friend awful bad to promise all that. So help me, if it's a friend you ran off looking for, it's a friend you found." "Dismissed, both of you," said the king. "But do change out of those smelly clothes." Retreating toward the golden doors, the prince beside him, Jemmy felt a sparkle rise into his eyes. "You got me off without so much as a single whack," he whispered. "I couldn't bear all the yowling and bellowing." "I wouldn't yowl and bellow." "But I would, Jemmy." And Jemmy caught the twinkle in his eyes. Almost at the doors, they were stopped by the king's voice. "One more thing." The king broke into a smile you could warm your hands over. "If you boys decide to run away again, take me with you." In the days that followed, ballad sellers began to cry out new and final verses to the notorious life of Hold Your Nose Billy and his partner Cutwater. An old rat catcher had seen them flee from the sewer, and he'd seen them stow away aboard a ship raising its sails for a long voyage. It was a convict ship bound for a speck of an island in distant waters. A convict island. Note: readers often ask if a story is true. This tale is a work of the imagination, but the most surprising part of it is true. Some royal households of past centuries did keep whipping boys to suffer the punishments due a misbehaving prince. History is alive with lunacies and injustices. As Jemmy would say, "Gah!" I hope you guys loved that book. I thought it was awesome, The Whipping Boy by Sid Fleischman. And we'll talk on our Google Classroom a little bit later about some of the other words that you might not have understood. And maybe we can have a little online discussion about your thoughts on the book. So anyways, talk to you soon.